in the workshop. We're heading to the Everest Base Camp. Weather is so fantastic, and this was our golden goal, and we're heading for it.
Just 10 days ago, 14 men embarked on a trek through the Himalayas, uncertain of the outcome. And after 40 miles of trekking at elevations beyond 17,000 feet, all 14 men arrived together at base camp on the southern side of Mount Everest.
Everest Base Camp!
So you talk a lot about the true summit. What is the false summit?
I think the false summit is always geographic. It's always an achievement. It's always a box that you check. It's career advancement. It's all these temporal things that we do primarily to feel better about ourselves and to maybe perhaps help other people think more highly of us. That to me would be more of a false summit, where it's always connected with a false identity. Those two always go hand in hand. And it's really as simple as this. If you don't know who you are, you will always be defined by what you do.
I first met Kevin DeVries back in 1998. He was a national ministry leader who at the time had never climbed a mountain. We had a brief conversation, unaware that Kevin's life would soon take a drastic turn, marking the beginning of a journey that 25 years later would lead us both to the Himalayas.
We made it, man. Made it to Lukla.
Yep, world's most dangerous airport. About 9,000 some odd feet, runway that drops off into nothing. Feels good to actually do something. All this nervous energy and adrenaline is now being put to use. And we got 14 guys with us and some world-class Sherpas. So we're pretty stoked. Looks like a great day ahead.
Kevin, what do you think, man?
This is pretty high. And I don't know if you can see it on the video, but this thing is bouncing.
After we reach base camp, Kevin has made the surprising decision to continue ahead and summit a neighboring mountain in the region called Island Peak. It isn't the highest or the most difficult mountain Kevin's ever climbed, but it's significant because just 2 years ago, while training for a marathon, Kevin collapsed on the road after suffering a cardiac arrest. The EMTs on the scene were able to revive him only after he'd been dead for nearly 15 minutes. Now, only 2 years since his near-death experience, Kevin is attempting to summit again. The looming question, will this be a new chapter in Kevin's explorations or the end of his climbing career? I've heard Kevin's story many times, but only one version of it. I want to know more about the mountains of his past to understand what's driving him to Island Peak today. Because we're here exactly 100 years after George Mallory's first summit attempt of Everest, I thought Mallory would be a good place to start.
So in the 1920s, a reporter asked George Mallory, who arguably was the best climber of his generation, why he was climbing Everest, and he tersely replied, because it's there. And that's probably the best answer that most adventurous and most climbers and explorers have been able to give, is just to give a pretty obvious answer to what could be a bit of an unsettling question. I think George Mallory answered that way largely in part because of a book that I read. It's called Into the Silence, and it's written by Wade Davis. It took him nearly a decade to write it, but he did a tremendous amount of research on all the British expeditionary members that went to Everest on the north side in 1921, 22, and 24, and came to the conclusion that because most of the men that were on that expedition were from World War I and fought on the Western Front in combat, that many of them were seeking the exact title of the book, which was Into Silence. They were trying to find a space of healing. They were trying to find a space where they could somehow forget or transcend some of the horror that they experienced. And I'm sure there was some of that collective sense of, wow, we need to make up for, a lost generation. I mean, World War I wiped out generations in Europe. I believe and agree with Wade Davis that these men were highly traumatized. The only word they had for it during that era was shell shock. But they were individuals who had already reconciled themselves to death. They'd already done that dance. They already knew what it was like to wake up every day and know it could be their last, because millions of men were being killed on an unprecedented scale in human history. Mallory represents all of us, where when there's an uncomfortable question that comes to the forefront, we dodge it as quick as we can to not have to deal with some of the larger, more hidden motives that cause us to do the things that we do.
What if that same reporter would have asked you why you were climbing Rainier 25 years ago? What would you have said?
I would have answered much the same. I was trying to find something in that moment that would literally, not just metaphorically, but literally help me transcend above the clouds of my own confusion, my own chaos, and capture some kind of sunrise, and to see that, not just visually, but to feel it and sense it in my soul that, wow, there could be a better tomorrow. And there is a place inside the human soul that the sun is always shining. And I was trying to find that space.
In the past, whenever I've asked Kevin about his adventures, he's always been reluctant to talk about it. And it makes sense. It wasn't a spirit of adventure driving Kevin to the mountains. He was searching for healing.
Visit the Alps, I've seen the Rockies, I've climbed the Andes, but there's no other place on earth that can give you the scale that you see here in the Himalayas. This is the point when you really start feeling the altitude. We're basically at the top of the Rockies right now, altitude-wise, but you don't sleep at the top of the Rockies. You sleep down in the valleys, so our bodies are not allowing us to really get into long, deep sleeps.
What are we at, like 14 something?
So yeah, we're 14 So we just have to be patient, understand that our body's trying to figure out what's going on, and there's just no air. It's going to only get thinner and thinner as we go up, and it'll be harder and harder to sleep.
In less than a week, our story will end, not at base camp, but here at Island Peak. Up to this point, Kevin has successfully summited every mountain he's ever climbed on the first attempt. But now, 10 years since his last climb, it seems like there's more at stake than just a summit. It's difficult to know what will cost him more, success or failure.
So you said you were looking for healing in the mountains. What was the source of that wound? Can we go back to that event?
So just like Mallory in the 1920s, who was driven, I believe, to climb mountains because of his untreated shell shock from fighting on the Western Front in World War I, my first divorce drove me into the mountains and to the ends of the earth to try and somehow heal the pain that I was feeling inside, and to somehow find a surgeon who could heal and take away the shrapnel that was in my soul. At the time, I was a national ministry leader, and the way the first marriage ended, it just felt like a public spectacle, and there was just a lot of shame. And I ended up living, ultimately, a false narrative for a decade and a half after that. It was all about me. I'm gonna have a successful business, I'm gonna travel the world, I'm gonna summit every mountain, I'm gonna journey to the ends of the earth, but I found myself at the end of that decade and a half in a very desperate situation where I felt totally disconnected from my own story. I just felt that I was fundamentally flawed, that there was something about me that was unfixable. I felt detached. I felt a tremendous amount of despair, a tremendous amount of disengagement, where I was there, but I was not there. And there's nothing more desperate or despairing than to watch your life unfold and you can't connect with other people on a deep and meaningful level, the people that you want to love and the people that are trying to love you back. That disengagement and that despair led to a second divorce, a business bankruptcy, and shortly thereafter living in a vehicle for the next 5 years. I just felt like the situation was hopeless. There's a tremendous amount of despair when you enter into that space where you don't feel like your future is going to be better than what it was in the past or ever will be. And it leads you into some pretty dark moments, where you're trying to process, do I still want to stay in this story?
Kevin's story is all too common. For many, the greatest power in the world is shame. Through the wounds and failures of our past, shame tells us we're unfixable, fundamentally flawed, and we believe it. More than anything in the world, we believe it. So we climb higher and higher, no matter the cost. searching for transformation just beyond the clouds. Unaware that no summit in the world has the power to change who failure says we are.
सिरानी सम्झनीमा बित्यो सपनी चाँडै फर्किया आउनु हे मेरी मायालु हे मेरी मायालु
True Michigan man, man of ice. All right, so we're off to Kalapatar, about 18,500 feet, taller than anything in Europe and a couple of other continents as well, and we're ready to get at it.
This is nuts, man. Trekkers going both directions. Rocks are covered in ice. And then yaks. Jeez.
So I'm standing right now at about the same exact height as Mount Ararat. And now we find ourselves in the Everest region, nowhere near any of the peaks that surround us.
So you reach a point where you're living in your truck for 5 years. A lot of people don't make it back from that place. What was the turning point for you?
So from 2009 to 2013, I served as a lead mountaineer for a group of scientists on Mount Ararat in Turkey. That particular region of the world borders Iran. It's just 10 clicks away. There's a tremendous amount of geopolitical tension that's existed there for decades. Tens of thousands of people have been killed between the PKK, and in return, the Turkish army has done pretty much the same. And Mount Ararat happens to be right in the epicenter of that. So to keep ourselves safe, as a group of mostly Americans, we always had a security detail with us every year. And in 2013, the guys that we had gathered while we were filming a documentary basically pulled me aside and just said, hey, you know, we've been watching you and we feel like you've got what we got. They said, when we look into your eyes, it's this 2,000-yard vacuous stare. The lights are on, nobody's home. And then they went on to say something that was incredibly powerful, and I'll poetically synthesize it, but they essentially said, you have a lot of pain in your past, and you're punishing your past as a result of it. You have not reconciled yourself with some difficult parts of your story, and it's rather obvious that you're running from that. And this whole project that we were all a part of, this documentary, was a great distraction to help me not to think about those things and to just get me, you know, give me some kind of distance from those type of memories. And then they also said, because you're punishing your past, you're also fearing your future. There's a lot of anxiety. It's like you're always waiting for the next foot to fall. You're waiting for some type of other incident or event to happen that's going to change the trajectory of your life in a negative way. And then they went on to say something that I'll never forget. They said, because you're punishing your past and because you're fearing your future, you're never now. You're just not here. You're not present. And that struck a huge chord because that was the first time I believe, well, at least that I was able to listen to. I'm sure other people attempted the same, many counselors, but to have these 3 special ops guys speak that into my life, it gave me a clue as to how my story had developed over all of these years. It gave me some breadcrumbs along the trail. It gave me something of substance that I could identify and that I could seek healing for, which was trauma.
So 25 years ago, you go to Rainier because you're broken, you're looking for healing, life's falling apart. You go to Ararat and you identify trauma. So what is different about the Kevin who's climbing 25 years later here, and what would help to bring about the change that you were looking for?
Yeah. Well, people will notice throughout this story that we're telling together that Kevin is not alone. He's with a group of men, and we are encouraging one another, and we're journeying together because we like to say in our fellowship, change happens in community. It doesn't happen as an individual. And that's hard for men to understand because we tend to embrace the cowboy mythos, you know, the individualism, the guy that lives alone on a big giant ranch. They're just waiting for someone to step over the fence so they could do something. And I think men treat their interior geography in much the same way. Don't get too close. And the old Kevin would have been doing this just for Kevin, and it would have been just Kevin, and he wouldn't have invited anybody else to be part of this journey because the journey was about him. It was that way because Kevin didn't know who he was. Don't journey together, we die alone.
It's fitting that our journey ends where it all began. Exactly 100 years ago today, George Mallory was preparing to attempt his first summit of Everest. Maybe he was climbing out of sheer joy, or maybe trauma really was at the heart of it all. We'll never know for sure. But we know now why Kevin was climbing all those years ago. His belief that he was unfixable and fundamentally flawed drove him to the mountains, searching for a new identity, only to find it in a brotherhood. But now, Kevin is climbing Island Peak. If he's already found healing, then after all these years, what's he trying to prove? The next morning, the trekking team heads back to Kathmandu, while Kevin and 3 other team members continue ahead to prepare for their summit of Island Peak. I thought there was only one way to successfully end this story. Kevin, arms raised, victoriously summiting Island Peak. Get some great summit footage, roll the credits. But just 2 days into his ascent, for the first time in his life, Kevin decided not to climb. And surprisingly, he was thrilled. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this trip wasn't about his heart or his successful summit. Kevin wasn't trying to prove to the world that he could still climb. He was proving to himself that he no longer needed to. So, 2 years ago you die, and now you're summiting Island Peak. But what if your heart doesn't hold out, and this is the end of your climbing career?
You know, after 2 divorces, a bankruptcy, living in a vehicle for 5 years, and then experiencing a near-death experience some 2.5 years ago, I've just come to discover, and I've come to the conclusion that I am not defined by what I do. And as a young man, I couldn't say that. As a middle-aged man, I can say, that's true. I'm not defined by what I do. I'm defined by who I am and whose I am. And that to me means that I am a beloved son of Almighty God. And that's enough. There's nothing left to prove. There's nothing I can do to make him love me more. There's nothing I can do to make people think that I'm somehow greater than what I am. Yeah, Everest literally sits outside this tent, and Everest Base Camp is what we are on right now, a moving glacier called Everest Base Camp. But it's just, I don't really care. And it's not to diminish the people who that's their dream. I was there, you know, just a few years ago even. But it is to say that I've reached a place where I feel like I've already climbed Everest within. I feel like I've already climbed those summits. And life to me now means more if it's done with people and if it's done together, where you climb together as a group and you find that true summit. It's a spiritual space, and it's a space where change can happen because you're allowing other people to speak into your life, and you're allowing yourself to listen to your life and to learn the tale that it's telling. And it has to happen through this inward journey, which to me requires more courage. It's much easier to climb a mountain. It's much harder to climb the mountain within. But that's where I think we do our best work as brothers in Christ, is we invite each other into the greatest journey of all, which is within.